How's it going, you awesome bunch of bakers? Hope you're having a fine day so far. Welcome back to another sweet bake video. Today we're making molasses raisin bread, so let's get in the kitchen and see how it's done. Once again, someone in the comment section of one of my videos has suggested an absolute winner of a recipe. They said that molasses raisin bread was their favorite bread ever. So I looked it up, wrote the recipe to fit my style, made this video, and now we can all enjoy this bread. Molasses is a sweet, thick black syrup, usually made from sugarcane. There are different types of molasses, varying in sugar content and flavor. Here in the UK, it's called black treacle, and that is what I'll be using in this video. I'm not much of an expert when it comes to these syrups, so treacle may be different from molasses, I don't know. But it worked perfectly fine for this application. You can use molasses, you can use treacle, it's up to you. And if you're not a fan of raisins, you can swap them for some other dry fruit. Adjust the recipe to your taste. It is so simple you can't go wrong. So let's get right to it. Let me show you how it's done so you can make yours. Starting with the ingredients. We need some white bread flour, yeast, salt, an egg, molasses or treacle, butter, raisins or some other dried fruit, and water. A very simple set of ingredients for a very simple recipe. As for the equipment, we'll need a bowl, scales, a dough scraper, a temperature probe, and a tin for baking the loaf. I'm going to use my USA Pan 2-pound Pullman tin. This time without the lid. Since we need to soak the raisins, I thought why not kill two birds with one stone and incorporate a scald in this recipe. It's going to make the bread softer and make it stay softer for longer. Scalding usually involves just flour and boiling water, and that is what we are starting with. 10% of the flour and all of the water. To make the final dough easier to mix, we can add additional ingredients to the scald, like the salt, the butter, and the treacle. And we will also add the raisins into the mix. So with this one step, we'll scald our flour, we will ensure that all the ingredients are evenly distributed, and we will also get to soak the raisins. If you are not familiar with scalding, then you should check out the video about it in the Principles of Baking playlist. I go into quite a bit more detail there. But in short, the boiling water cooks the flour, it gelatinizes the starch, makes the flour absorb the water better, and it makes the resulting bread a lot softer. Once the mix is done, cover it up and leave it to cool down. I left my scald sit on the table for around 2 hours. Make sure to scrape the condensate from the lid back into the scald, because it's part of the hydration. I want this dough to rise relatively quickly, and that's why I didn't leave it to cool down completely. I continued by making the final dough when it hit around 29 degrees Celsius or 84 degrees Fahrenheit. At this point, the temperature in my kitchen was around 22 degrees Celsius or 72 degrees Fahrenheit. Let's move on to making the final dough. Add the yeast and the egg to the scald, and then mix until smooth. And then add the remaining flour, grab your dough scraper and mix it to a dough. It will be quite loose and messy to begin with, but don't worry, that's normal. Let's get back to the temperature for a second. For me, this is an unusually warm liquid that I'm using, and it will be an unusually warm final dough temperature too. And when we look at the amount of yeast in this recipe, that is unusually high too. But even with the high temperature and the increased amount of yeast, this dough will still take an hour and a half for bulk fermentation and an hour and a half of final proofing. And that is because of the high sugar content. Contrary to popular belief, adding more sugar to your dough does not make it ferment more quickly. That only happens up to a point, which is at around 3% in baker's percentage terms. This dough has a 20% sugar content, so we want it to be warm and yeasty. And as you just saw, the final dough temperature was 27 degrees Celsius or 80 degrees Fahrenheit. The bulk fermentation will take an hour and a half, punctuated by 2 folds at 30-minute intervals. Folding replaces kneading in such a recipe. The dough will go from soggy and sticky to nice and cohesive in just a couple of folds. To perform the fold, place the dough out on the table with the smooth side down, flatten it out, fold the edge over the middle, going around in a circle until you reach point where you started. Then flip it smooth side up again, tighten it against the table, place it back into the bowl, cover it up, that's your fold done. Leave it to ferment for another 30 minutes and then perform the second fold. And the second fold is performed exactly the same way as the first one. But this time the dough will already feel quite tight coming out of the bowl, so you won't need to fold it as many times to feel it tensing up. After the second fold, place the dough back into the bowl for another 30 minutes of fermentation to finish off the bulk fermentation stage. Once that is done, the dough should be nice and puffy. When you pick up the bowl and shake it, it should have a nice wobble to it. Before we move on to final shaping, let's prepare the baking tin by brushing it with some butter. It will not only prevent the dough from sticking, but also toast the sides and bottom nicely. Once that's done, let's move on to final shaping. Dust your dough lightly with flour, pop it out on the table with the smooth side down, then flatten it out gently. You could shape this dough in different ways. You could cut it into 3 pieces, roll the pieces out to long strands and braid it. You could divide it into smaller pieces and make some rolls with it, but I chose the simplest shaping method this time. All we need to do here is roll it up nice and tight. I wanted to keep it as easy as possible. I try to make most of my recipes beginner friendly, and I'm sure the seasoned bakers also appreciate the easy methods sometimes. Okay, after final shaping, the loaf goes in the tin, ready for final proofing. The final proofing time will of course depend on the temperature of your kitchen. It took me around an hour and a half. The loaf needs to be twice the size before it goes in the oven. During the final hour of fermentation, preheat the oven to 150 degrees Celsius, 300 degrees Fahrenheit, fan on. It's a big loaf, so we want a low and slow bake. We don't want the crust getting too dark before the bread is fully baked. The next step is optional. You don't need to glaze it, but I decided to brush it with some milk before baking. Alternatively, you could brush it with some egg or just leave it plain. It's up to you. Okay, this bad boy is ready for the oven. The initial bake will take around 45 minutes. After which we'll remove the tin from the oven, remove the loaf from the tin, and then place the loaf back into the oven without the tin to finish off the crust. Place it in the oven standing up as it was before and bake it for another 15 minutes. Turn it around halfway through the final bake to ensure that the crust bakes evenly on both sides. If you are unsure of the doneness of your bread, you can take its temperature. For an enriched loaf like this, 92 degrees Celsius should be sufficient, and that is 198 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, the next step is also optional. I decided to brush my loaf with sugar syrup after baking. It will make it even shinier and sweeter. Not that it needs it, but I don't think we got much to lose at this point. You could also brush it with some butter, or leave it just the way it is. It's perfectly fine. I'm not here to tell you what to do, I'm just giving you ideas. But there you have it. That's how I make molasses raisin bread. It's a gigantic, puffy, super sweet loaf of bread. A slice of this with some butter and jam is a full-on dessert. That dark, rich molasses flavor and the sweet raisins work really well together, and the crumb is extra soft thanks to the scald. A quick note on the size of this loaf. It is pretty huge, and I baked it in my USA pan Pullman tin, which is larger than a regular 2-pound loaf tin. And even so, the loaf rose above the rim of the tin. So if you're going to use a regular 2-pound loaf tin, I would suggest reducing the amount of ingredients by at least a quarter. Otherwise this thing is going to go for a walk whilst it's in the oven. Don't forget that you can post pictures of your bakes on our Flickr group. You'll find the link below the video or in the pinned comment in the comments section. And don't forget to check out breadbakingathome.com. It is full of useful and technical information. The link for it is also below the video. So what do you think this recipe? Was your favorite type of sweet loaf? Let me know down in the comments. For more videos like this one, click over here. Subscribe to the channel, click right here. That's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one.